On the 11th of September 1944, shadows were growing long along the Roer River. 5 men from the 2nd Platoon, Troop B, 85th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, reached the west bank near the village of Stolberg, Luxembourg. Their commander had told them to hurry if they wanted credit as the first American patrol on German soil. The bridge ahead was demolished, but the water ran shallow. Sergeant Warner W. Holzinger led his men across, wading through the current to the far bank. They climbed a hill toward a cluster of farm buildings. Nearby, they counted 19 or 20 concrete pillboxes. One of them had a chicken shed built around it. The men made only a hasty inspection before turning back. At 18:05 that evening, the report went up the chain of command. A patrol had crossed into Germany. The message carried more weight than anyone yet understood. Here was the Siegfried Line, the west wall of Hitler's propaganda films, the supposedly impregnable fortress of the Reich. What the patrol found was something else entirely. Dust lay thick inside those concrete rooms. Seepage stained the floors. No mines lay buried in the approach fields. No barbed wire blocked the gaps. The fortifications had suffered 4 years of neglect, more troubling to the German High Command. Few soldiers remained to man them. Across the entire Western Front, from the Dutch coast to the Swiss border, the defenders were a collection of shattered divisions and emergency scratch units. The race for the West Wall had begun, and the first Americans were already across. The question hanging over every command post that week was whether the Allies could push through the gap before the enemy recovered. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, had bet on a broad front advance toward the Ruhr, but the logistical system was breaking down. Gasoline trucks ran 300-mile round trips just to deliver a day's rations. Ammunition reserves sat in depots far behind the Seine. The Red Ball Express, a desperate improvisation of military trucks pushed to their limit, could not keep pace with the armies it was meant to feed. The pursuit across France and Belgium had been a marvel of speed. But now, at the very gates of Germany, the machinery of supply was failing. The window of opportunity was closing fast. 2 days later, on the 13th of September, General J. Lawton Collins launched his 7th Corps against the West Wall in a full-scale reconnaissance in force. His plan was simple and aggressive. Break through the forward band of fortifications, the Scharnhorst Line, before the Germans could strengthen it. Then push into the Stolberg corridor, bypass Aachen, and drive toward the Roer River. The 3rd Armored Division struck near Huertgen. Task Force Lovelady blasted a path through the Dragon's Teeth, concrete pyramids that blocked the roads, and found the pillboxes behind them abandoned. The Germans had fled. Within hours, the armor was through the first belt and moving northeast. The 1st Division moved alongside, swinging east of Aachen to seal off the city without fighting inside it. By nightfall, the southern and eastern high ground belonged to the Americans. North of Collins, General Charles H. Corlett had his own problems with the 19th Corps. His 2 divisions, the 30th Infantry and the 2nd Armored, were still west of the Albert Canal when the 7th Corps struck the West Wall. The gasoline shortage had held them immobile for 4 days. Now they moved fast. The 30th Division crossed the Meuse near Liège and pushed north, while the cavalry cleared the east bank. On the left, the 2nd Armored crossed the Albert Canal at Beringen, using a bridge the British had already secured. The German defenders, the 49th and 275th Divisions, were skeletal formations with little artillery and almost no tanks. They fell back in confusion. Maastricht, the capital of the Dutch province of Limburg, fell on the 14th without a real fight. The German commander opposite Aachen, General Erich Brandenberger of the 7th Army, watched the collapse with growing alarm. He had almost nothing left to stop the American columns. The 116th Panzer Division was a shell. The 9th Panzer Division had been fed into the line piecemeal and was bleeding away. That night, the first trains of the 12th Infantry Division began arriving at the Roer River town of Wörlitz. Here was a fresh division, fully equipped, 14,800 strong. Hitler himself had ordered its transfer from East Prussia. The race for the West Wall was no longer a dead heat. The Germans had won the margin they needed. On the 14th of September, General Leonard T. Gouraud sent his 5th Corps against the West Wall in 2 separate sectors. In the north, the 28th Division attacked the high ground southwest of the Schnee-Eifel. The 109th Infantry ran into machine gun fire from pillboxes 700 yards short of the Dragon's Teeth and went to ground. The 110th Infantry fared no better. Without tanks or artillery ammunition for sustained bombardment, the infantry could not move. But the regimental commander, Colonel Theodore Seeley, did not stop attacking. On the 15th, a battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Floyd Davison reached Hill 553 after engineers crawled forward under fire and blew a roadblock with 50-pound satchels of TNT. In 45 minutes, the battalion stormed 17 pillboxes and captured 58 prisoners. The victory did not last. That night, German flame-throwing vehicles improvised from armored half-tracks crept toward Company F in the darkness. Private Roy Fleming heard the clank of tracks, then the sudden hiss of flame. The company radio sent a frantic plea for help. "King Sugar to anybody, we are having a counter-attack. Tanks, infantry, flamethrowers." The radio could transmit but not receive. No help came. When morning broke, Company F could muster only 44 men. The lost pillboxes had to be retaken. The momentum was gone. The 28th Division's penetration of the West Wall had cost almost 1,500 casualties, and there was no strength left to exploit it. South of the infantry fight, General Lunsford E. Oliver's 5th Armored Division found a different kind of war. The boundary between two German army groups ran through the village of Wallendorf, a seam in the defense. Combat Command R crossed the Roer River on the 14th, pushed through undefended pillboxes, and by nightfall was 6 miles inside Germany. The next day, the armor raced for the Pruim River, scattering a company of Mark IV tanks and seizing the high ground near Mettendorf. General Garau saw the opening and ordered the division to swing north, strike the rear of the German forces opposing the 28th Division, and take the communications center of Bitburg. The prospect of a genuine breakthrough was real, but the logistics of the First Army could not support the opportunity. The gasoline was gone, the ammunition was low, the weather was closing in, grounding the fighter bombers that might have kept the German reinforcements at bay. The Corps commander, General Giraud, understood the equation. On the 16th of September, he ordered the 5th Armored Division to halt its offensive and consolidate the Wallendorf bridgehead for defense. There would be no drive on Bitburg. The chance to unhinge the German defense of the Eifel was slipping away as fast as it had appeared. The Germans did not let the bridgehead stand uncontested. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, scraped together a Panzer Brigade, a Volksgrenadier Division, and the remnants of Panzer Lehr and hurled them against the American perimeter. The fighting was sharp. On the 19th, the Germans struck Hill 407, the main position of Combat Command R. American artillery, adjusted from a Piper Cub observation plane, broke up the first assault. Then the weather cleared, and P-47 Thunderbolts of the 365th Group tore into the German columns, knocking out 10 tanks. But the pressure did not stop. German infiltration reached the bridges over the Sauer. On the 22nd of September, the last American troops pulled back across the river. The Wallendorf adventure was over. That same day, the 19th Corps had reached the German border north of Aachen, but General Corlett postponed his assault on the West Wall. The weather was still bad, ammunition was still scarce, and the Corps' left flank was exposed to a gap of more than 35 miles between the Americans and the nearest British forces. The Germans had thrown the 183rd Volksgrenadier Division into the pillboxes north of Aachen, blocking the route. On the 22nd of September, all 3 corps of the First Army went over to the defensive. The pursuit was finished. The Siegfried Line campaign, the long, brutal struggle against fortifications, forest, and mud, had begun. The first major crack in Allied optimism came not from the West Wall, but from a plan so daring it seemed to promise a shortcut to victory. Field Marshal Bernard L. Montgomery proposed dropping 3.5 airborne divisions behind enemy lines in the Netherlands, seizing bridges over the major rivers, and opening a corridor for the Second British Army to cross the Rhine. General Dwight D. Eisenhower approved the plan, hoping to outflank the West Wall and secure a bridgehead into Germany before winter. The operation was called Market Garden, the largest airborne assault the world had ever seen. On the morning of September the 17th, the greatest armada of troop-carrying aircraft ever assembled took flight from airfields across England. 1,545 transport planes and 478 gliders carried more than 20,000 paratroopers and glidermen toward the Netherlands. The weather was fair, the escort fighters dense, and the preliminary bombing had silenced most of the German flak batteries along the route. Losses were phenomenally low, less than 3% of the aircraft. The drops themselves were the most accurate any of the 3 divisions had ever achieved. The 101st Airborne Division, under General Maxwell D. Taylor, landed near Eindhoven to seize bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal and the Dommel River. The 82nd Airborne Division, commanded by General James M. Gavin, dropped near Grave and Nijmegen, with orders to capture the bridges over the Maas and the Wall. The British 1st Airborne Division landed 6 to 8 miles west of Arnhem, its drop zones chosen for safety from flack and boggy ground, but at a fateful distance from the bridge over the Lower Rhine. What the Allied planners did not know was that the Germans had moved 2 SS Panzer divisions into the Arnhem area for rehabilitation. The 9th SS and 10th SS Panzer divisions, though under strength, were veteran formations with tanks and experienced crews. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had placed the 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters at Arnhem to oversee their refitting. When the first parachutes appeared in the Dutch sky, the Germans were surprised, but they had a powerful reserve within striking distance of the most critical objective. The 101st Airborne Division seized its bridges quickly on the first day. The town of Zonn fell, and a bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal was captured intact, though the Germans demolished it later as the paratroopers consolidated. General Taylor's men pushed into Eindhoven on the second day, making contact with the leading tanks of the British 30th Corps. The highway from Eindhoven to Nijmegen, which the British called Hell's Highway, was open, but it was a single road running through flat, open country that the Germans could easily interdict. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division faced disaster from the start. The drop zones were 6 to 8 miles from the bridge, and the lightly armed paratroopers had to fight their way through German positions to reach the objective. The 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge and held it, but the rest of the division could not break through the German cordon. The 2 SS Panzer divisions, alerted by Field Marshal Model, moved quickly to block the approaches, surrounding the British perimeter. By September the 20th, the situation was critical. The 101st and 82nd Airborne had secured their sectors, but the British at Arnhem were fighting for survival. General Gavin ordered a daring assault across the Roer River in open boats to capture the Nijmegen Bridge from the south. Under heavy machine gun fire, the paratroopers paddled across the 200-yard-wide river in canvas boats, suffering heavy casualties. They seized the southern end of the bridge, and the British tanks of the 30th Corps roared across, linking up with the 82nd, but the bridge at Arnhem was still 20 miles away. The delay at Nijmegen cost the Allies any chance of relieving Arnhem. The British 30th Corps, advancing up a single road under constant German fire, could not move fast enough. The 101st Airborne fought to keep Hell's Highway open against German counterattacks that cut the road at several points. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded, cut off from supplies, and running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The Germans tightened the noose, attacking from all sides with tanks and infantry. On September the 25th, the decision was made to evacuate the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division from Arnhem. Under cover of darkness, the remnants of the division crossed the Lower Rhine in small boats, leaving behind their wounded and their dead. The evacuation was a desperate, heartbreaking operation, carried out under German fire. Of the 10,000 men who had dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,500 escaped across the river. The operation had failed in its main objective. The Allies had not crossed the Rhine, and the West Wall remained unbroken. The northern prong of the Allied advance was halted, and the exposed salient from Eindhoven to Nijmegen would require months of hard fighting to expand. The British 1st Airborne Division was virtually destroyed as a fighting force, and total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000 men. Yet the operation was not without strategic value. The Allies had seized a narrow corridor that outflanked the West Wall from the north, and the bridges at Nijmegen and Grave would prove vital in later offensives. The campaign had also stripped the German 15th Army of its escape route from the Schelde estuary, setting the stage for the clearing of Antwerp's approaches. Market Garden had been a gamble, and it had failed, but it had also demonstrated the immense power and terrible cost of airborne warfare. After Market Garden, the Allies held a narrow corridor from Eindhoven to Nijmegen, but the right flank of that corridor was dangerously exposed. The German-held Peel marshes formed a boggy salient that threatened the entire British position. A spoiling attack became necessary to push the Germans back and secure the ground for future operations. The Peel marshes were a landscape built for defence. Flat fields of peat bog lay cut by drainage ditches, and narrow roads ran like causeways through the mud. Autumn rains had turned the ground into a cold, clinging sponge that sucked at boots and vehicle wheels alike. The U.S. 7th Armored Division entered combat here for the first time, and it was a harsh introduction. German machine gun nests, hidden in isolated farm buildings, could hold up an entire company for hours. The fighting was close, personal and slow, with yards measured in blood. By early October, the spoiling attack had done its job. The German threat to the corridor flank was reduced, though not eliminated. The 7th Armored Division had paid the price of experience in a landscape that made a mockery of mobile warfare. Meanwhile, the great port of Antwerp sat idle. The Germans still held both banks of the Schelde estuary, blocking all shipping from the sea. Opening Antwerp was a strategic necessity, and the task fell to the 21st Army Group, reinforced by American divisions. The battlefield of the Schelde was a drowned world. German engineers had opened the dikes, turning vast polders into shallow lakes. Dry ground existed only on narrow causeways and dikes, and every one of them was a kill zone swept by machine gun and mortar fire. The US 104th Division, newly arrived in theatre, joined Canadian and British troops in the assault. Progress was measured in yards per day. Each flooded field, each shattered farmhouse, each dike had to be taken by infantry moving through chest-deep water under artillery fire. The Battle of the Schelde would grind on well into November. Antwerp remained closed while the Germans fought for every yard of flooded ground. The cost in lives was high, but there was no choice. The port had to open before the Allies could sustain a final drive into Germany. As the Schelde campaign began, the First Army turned its attention to Aachen. The city was the first major German urban centre to face an Allied assault, and Hitler had ordered it held to the last man. General Courtney Hodges directed an encirclement to isolate the garrison. The 1st Division attacked from the south and east, but the German defenders did not break. Machine guns fired from cellars and upper floors, and artillery crashed down on every street. American tanks fired point-blank into stone walls, and infantry cleared rooms with grenades and bayonets. General Charles Corlitt's 19th Corps committed the 30th Division from the north to complete the ring around the city. On the German side, Colonel Gerhard Wilk commanded the garrison with grim determination. His men fought from behind barricades of rubble, and every block cost American lives. On October 20th, after 10 days of house-to-house fighting, Colonel Wilk surrendered the ruined city. Aachen became the first German city to fall to the Allies. The medieval cathedral stood scarred but upright among the rubble, a silent witness to the cost of urban combat. While the fight for Aachen raged, another battle was brewing in the forest to the south. The Roer River dams at Schwammenauel and Erft held a hidden threat. If the Germans opened the floodgates, the Roer Valley would become impassable, and any American advance would drown. The key to the dams was the village of Schmidt, perched on a ridge deep in the Huertgen forest. General Louis Craig's 9th Division drew the mission of taking it. The approach led through dense pine woods that blocked observation and canalized every move into predictable kill zones. On October 16th, after 10 days of hard fighting, the 9th Division launched its assault on Schmidt itself. Artillery fire bursting in the treetops created deadly tree bursts, sending splinters of wood and steel down on the men below. German machine guns covered every firebreak and trail. The infantry could not bring their numbers to bear in the close forest. The first attack on Schmidt failed short of its objective. German reserves moved in, and the 9th Division stalled. The Roer dams remained in enemy hands. The forest had already begun to claim its victims, and the costliest fighting was yet to come. A second attempt on Schmidt would fall to the 28th Division, commanded by General Norman Cotter. His men were veterans, but they faced the same impossible terrain. The plan called for a thrust along the Kal Trail, a narrow, unpaved route that wound through the heart of the forest. The Kal Trail became a death trap. Tanks and vehicles bogged down in the mud, creating a traffic jam visible from German observation posts. German artillery zeroed in on the stalled column. The infantry fought forward alone, without armor support into machine gun fire from 3 directions. The Germans counterattacked with veteran panzer grenadiers. The American forward positions at Commerscheit were cut off and surrounded. Communication broke down. Squads and platoons fought isolated actions, running low on ammunition, with wounded men dying in the cold November rain. The 28th Division suffered over 6,000 casualties in the Schmidt disaster. It was one of the costliest divisional actions of the entire campaign. The Roer dams remained in German hands, and the Huertgen forest had claimed another victim. The hard truth was settling in. The war in the West would not end quickly. By mid-November 1944, the Allied High Command was ready to launch a new offensive. The port of Antwerp was still not open. The Roer River dams remained in German hands. The Huertgen forest had swallowed 2 divisions without result. General Courtney Hodges' First Army and General William Simpson's Ninth Army planned a coordinated push to reach the Roer River on a broad front. Its code name was Operation Queen. On November 16th, the offensive began with a massive artillery bombardment. Hundreds of guns fired along the entire front. Fighter bombers from the 9th Tactical Air Command added their weight to the preparation. But the weather, as it had so often that autumn, turned against the attackers. Low clouds and fog grounded the plains after the first day. The infantry would have to fight without close air support. General J. Lawton Collins sent his 7th Corps forward in the Stolberg corridor. The 3rd Armoured Division under General Maurice Rose advanced quickly at first, pushing through the outer belt of German defences. But German reinforcements moved up from the Roer Plain, and the advance stalled. On the right, the 9th Division entered the Huertgen forest, where the trees seemed to close in like a roof. German artillery fired into the treetops, creating deadly bursts of wood splinters and steel that tore through the men below. The forest fighting was slow, brutal, and costly. Every trail was registered by German mortars. Every clearing was covered by machine guns. The mud was ankle-deep, then knee-deep as the rains continued. Medics struggled to bring wounded out on stretchers through the mire. Companies that entered the forest with 100 men came out with 40. The division gained ground by yards per day, not miles. On the left flank, General William Simpson's 9th Army was attacking through the west wall north of Huertgen. The plan called for the 13th Corps to capture the town of Geilenkirchen and then advance to the Roer. British troops from the 30th Corps assisted in the assault, providing artillery and armour support. The operation was codenamed Clipper. The 9th Army's infantry fought through rain and mud against a determined German defence. The 84th Division, attacking near Geilenkirchen, faced machine gun fire from pillboxes and farm buildings. Tanks bogged down in the soft fields. Progress was measured field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow. German counterattacks, led by small groups of tanks, struck the flanks of the American advance and forced delays. By November 20th, the 84th Division had taken Geilenkirchen. The west wall had been breached in this sector, but the Germans did not collapse. They fell back to the next line of defence, fighting rearguard actions as they went. Simpson's infantry pushed eastward, crossing the Roer River under fire. The Roer Plain lay ahead, flat and open, but the Germans had had time to prepare their defences. In the Huertgen forest, 5th Corps under General Edward Brooks committed the 8th Division to relieve the battered 28th. The fresh division found the same terrible conditions. Tree bursts killed men who had no cover. The mud made it impossible to dig proper foxholes. German snipers tied themselves to the branches of pine trees and shot men from above. The forest became a place of whispered fear and sudden, violent death. The 4th Division, which had been resting after the September fighting, was also sent into the forest. Its men found the same nightmare. The division attacked toward the villages of Huertgen and Kleinhau, but the Germans held each ridge and each trail intersection. Days of fighting brought small gains and many casualties. The forest seemed to have no end. By the first week of December, the Allied offensive had reached the Roer River on a broad front. The 9th Army's 13th Corps had pushed to the river near Linnich. The 19th Corps under General Raymond McLean had reached the river at Willich. The 7th Corps had advanced through the Stolberg corridor to the outskirts of Düren, but the German defenders held the east bank and the bridges were down. The critical objective remained uncaptured. The Roer River dams at Schwammenau and Erft were still in German hands. As long as the Germans held those dams, they could release the reservoir waters and flood the Roer Valley, trapping any American force that crossed the river. The First Army had tried twice to take the dams through Schmidt and failed. Now the Germans had had weeks to reinforce the sector. The campaign ended in frustration as winter set in. The ground froze at night and thawed by day, creating a sea of mud. The troops were exhausted, their equipment worn from months of combat. The offensive had gained ground, but not enough. The Roer dams remained a threat that would have to be dealt with later. The Siegfried Line campaign was not over, but it had reached a bitter pause. By the second week of December 1944, the Allied offensive along the Roer had run its course. The First Army under Courtney H. Hodges ordered limited attacks to improve positions and probe the German defences, but the main effort was spent. The objective that mattered most, the Roer River dams at Schwammenau and Erft, remained firmly in German hands, their floodgates a constant threat to any crossing. The damp, freezing weather turned every movement into a trial of endurance. On the 13th of December, the 2nd Infantry Division launched a set-piece attack to secure a key crossroads in the Huertgen forest area. Behind a heavy artillery preparation, the infantry moved forward against the familiar German defense of machine guns and mortars. They took the crossroads after sharp fighting, but the cost was heavy, and the advance stopped there. The German defenders still held the high ground overlooking the Roer Valley, and the dams loomed as an unsolved problem. By the 15th of December, the Siegfried Line campaign had reached its end. American troops held a line along the Roer River, but the great push into Germany had stalled a few miles short of the Rhine. The enemy had bought time, and the lull in the fighting was deceptive. 2 days later, on December the 16th, without warning, the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge, sending shockwaves through the Allied front and drawing every available division into a desperate winter struggle. The grinding experience of the West Wall taught hard lessons. The American soldier had proven his courage in the pillbox assaults and the forest fights, but the campaign had shown that fortified lines, autumn mud, and a stubborn enemy could blunt even the most determined offensive. The logistical machinery of the Allied armies would need to be stronger, and the tactics for breaching fixed defenses would have to improve. The stage for the final campaigns of 1945 was set by the blood and frustration of the Siegfried Line. After the war, Montgomery served as chief of the Imperial General Staff and died in 1976. Collins rose to Army Chief of Staff and retired in 1956. Corlett remained in the Army until retirement in 1946. Cotter became Deputy Commander of the 7th Army and retired as a Major General. Rose was killed in action near Paderborn in March 1945. Gavin retired as a Lieutenant General in 1958. Taylor served as Army Chief of Staff and died in 1987. Wilkes spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war. Oliver remained in the Army until 1948. Craig retired as a Major General in 1946. The men who fought through the Huertgen forest and the Stolberg corridor carried those memories for the rest of their lives. If you have family stories from the fall of 1944, a father or uncle who served in the push to the Roer, or a letter home from the Huertgen forest, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. We read everyone. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like to support our work. We deeply appreciate your time and your interest in this history. Thank you for listening.